The mare had not thrown anyone in 2 years. She had tried. She had arched and spun and bared her teeth at every rider who climbed her back since Thomas Ashby died, in a ditch at the edge of Ashbourne Park's North Field, and she had succeeded in removing all of them with varying degrees of violence within the first 30 seconds of contact. The grooms had stopped attempting her 3 months ago. The guests were warned. The visiting Earl of Casterton's daughter, Miss Helena Casterton, had been warned twice. She was, therefore, not warned a third time. The July morning was bright and still, and perhaps 20 people stood along the paddock fence when Mr. Fitch brought Caledonia out, brushed to a high shine, ears pinned, coal-black and enormous, against the pale gravel of the stable-yard. Miss Casterton's habit was ice blue. Her gloves were white. She mounted with the particular confidence of a woman who had never imagined that a horse might have an opinion of her, and for 11 seconds the paddock was entirely quiet. Then Caledonia began to move. Not the deliberate sideways violence she sometimes offered. Something faster and more indifferent, a sudden bunching of hindquarters and a low gathered surge, and Miss Casterton left the saddle with a short cry that the guests received in held silence. She landed in the grass at the paddock's center, unhurt and furious, and the mare stood exactly where she had stopped, stamping once. What happened next? No one could quite explain afterward. Caledonia turned her head. She walked at a slow, deliberate pace to the paddock's near corner, where a young woman in a gray dress and a white cap had been standing quite still against the fence post, a feed bucket in her left hand and her right hand open at her side. The mare walked to her, lowered her enormous dark head, and pressed her nose to the open palm. The stable-yard was silent. Penelope did not look at the guests. She looked at Caledonia, and she said something quiet that no one at the fence could hear, and she stroked the long arch of the horse's neck twice, slowly, from poll to shoulder. The mare stood with her ears forward and her sides breathing easy. At the fence's far end, Richard Ashby, Viscount Darnley, watched this with an expression that Mr. Fitch, who had served the family for 20 years, could not entirely name. He had not looked at the throne rider. He had looked at the maid. Penelope Marsh had come to Ashbourne Park in the autumn, when the beeches were still gold and the mornings already cold. She had arrived by the servants' entrance, as was correct, with a single trunk and a letter of reference from a lady in Ludlow that Mrs. Coburn, the housekeeper, received with the careful courtesy she offered to any young woman whose circumstances were visibly reduced from what her speech suggested. Penelope's speech was precise and quiet. She said please and thank you, and yes, ma'am, in tones that belonged to a curate's daughter, which she was. And she set about making herself useful with the particular diligence of someone who understood that usefulness was the only claim she had on this house. Her father, the Reverend Edmund Marsh of Clunton, had died the previous January, leaving behind debts that surprised everyone who thought they had known him, and a daughter who surprised no one who had. She had handled the solicitors herself, managed the sale of the small library that was the only asset of consequence, and written 14 letters seeking a position before this one opened. She did not speak of any of it. She did not speak much at all, beyond what was required, and Mrs. Coburn noted this with the private approval of a woman who had managed staff for 30 years and understood the difference between silence born of sullenness and silence born of discipline. Penelope's silence was the second kind. It was a working silence, a silence that moved through a room with the fireplace irons and the linen cupboard and the morning trays, and it did not ask for recognition. She had been at Ashbourne Park 3 weeks before. She understood that the black mare was the estate's real grief, not the Viscount's formal mourning clothes or Mrs. Viscount. Coburn's occasional pauses at the upper corridor window where the north field was visible, but the animal who had been Thomas Ashby's and was now nothing that anyone knew what to do with. Caledonia had come from Spain in Thomas Ashby's last letter, described as difficult and magnificent in equal measure, and she had arrived to his death and stood in the stable ever since, being fed and groomed at a distance by men who were afraid of her and understanding perfectly well that she was feared. The nights in autumn were cold, and the stable walls were thick, but not thick enough. Penelope was not the only maid who heard the horse. She was the only one who did not put her pillow over her ears and go back to sleep. The first night, she stood at the stable door in her nightgown, with her shawl pulled tight, and spoke to the horse through the wood in the same low tone she had used to read to her father, in his last months when the sound of a voice seemed to matter more than what the voice was saying. The sound stopped. She went back to bed. The second night, she opened the door and stood inside the threshold, not approaching, simply present. And Caledonia stood in the far corner of her stall with her sides heaving and one front hoof pawing the straw. And Penelope talked to her about nothing in particular. About the smell of the autumn air, and the color of the beeches, and the fact that the cook's cat had produced 6 kittens in the laundry press, and after 20 minutes the pawing stopped, and the great dark head lowered slightly. The 5th night, she went inside the stall. Mrs. Coburn found out from Mr. Pear. Fitch, who had seen the light under the stable door at 3 in the morning, and come to investigate, and found the maid sitting in the clean straw, with the horse's enormous head resting on her knee. He had reported it to Mrs. Coburn with an expression that mixed alarm with something he could not name. Mrs. Coburn had listened and then said that if Caledonia was quiet, she was not inclined to interfere. By January, Caledonia ate from Penelope's hand. By March, she followed the fence line when Penelope crossed the yard. By May, she stood with such equanimity under Penelope's brushing that Mr. Fitch had said it was unnatural, which Penelope received as the caution it was and ignored. The mare was not tame. She was trusted. The distinction mattered to both of them. Penelope did not think much about why the horse trusted her. She understood the bare mechanism well enough. She had come consistently, spoken quietly, asked nothing, and stayed when it was inconvenient. These were the same qualities her father had required of her in his last years, and she had them in abundance. She had not learned yet to ask whether they might deserve something in return. The house party arrived on a Thursday, in the first week of July. Lady Agatha Forsyth, the Dowager Viscountess Darnley, had organized it with the particular precision of a woman who understood that social machinery required tending even in grief, or perhaps especially in grief, and that her son was 34 years old and still wearing his brother's death as though it were a garment he had no intention of removing. The party numbered 16 in all. There were the Castertons and their daughter, a pair of connected cousins from London, 2 gentlemen from the Viscount's regiment days, a bishop's widow, and various others whose invitations signaled their usefulness to the dowager's design. The design was not spoken aloud in Penelope's presence. It did not need to be. Miss Helena Casterton was 20 years old, and at dinner, on the first evening, her diamonds were her mother's, and she wore them as though they were hers already, and she sat at the Viscount's left hand and spoke to him in a voice that was musical and carefully modulated, because she had been prepared for this dinner the way a painting is prepared for a particular wall. Penelope carried the fish course and the remove and the dessert plates, and was aware of the Viscount's presence at the table in the way she had been aware of it since October, which was a kind of awareness she had no useful name for and did not pursue. After dinner, in the withdrawing room, Lady Agatha said something low to Miss Casterton that made the young woman's gaze travel across the room and settle briefly on Penelope, who was collecting the dessert plates near the window. Miss Casterton's mouth curved in the particular way that distinguished consideration from interest. She said nothing. But later, when Penelope was called to see to the fire in the green sitting room where Lady Agatha was reading, the dowager did not wait for her to finish before she said, without raising her eyes from her book, that serving girls who made a habit of drawing attention to themselves in other people's households generally found themselves without positions rather sooner than they had planned. Penelope finished the fire. "Yes, my lady," she said, and withdrew. She had been told a version of this before in different rooms, by different women. She went to the stable that night, not because she was distressed, but because she had promised Caledonia an apple, and she kept her promises. The mare was restless, which was usual when the house was full and the smells were wrong and the routine had broken, and she stood at the gate with her ears moving independently in the way that meant she was cataloguing sounds and deciding which ones to trust. Penelope leaned against the gate and offered the apple on her flat palm, and watched Caledonia think about it and decide yes. She did not hear the step behind her until he spoke. She does not usually accept that, the Viscount said. He stood at the edge of the lamplight from the stable lantern, still in his evening coat, as though he had walked here from the house without planning to, and found himself arrived. He was a tall man who held himself with the controlled quietness of someone who had learned that large men disturb rooms without meaning to. And chosen stillness is the correction, Penelope turned. "She is particular about who gives it," she said. Her hands were perfectly steady. "I will return to the house directly, my lord. I did not come to send you back," he said. He stood at the gate's other side and looked at the horse, and Caledonia looked back at him with a mild alertness. She reserved for people she tolerated, which was not the same as the softness she offered Penelope. After a moment, he said, "She threw Thomas the morning before he died. He tried again the next day without telling anyone, and she threw him into the ditch at the North Field. We did not find him until past noon. Penelope was very still. I had told him not to write her," he said. "She was half broken and he was impatient, and I told him Tuesday evening, and he went at dawn on Wednesday. I was in the yard at first light to stop him. I was 40 seconds too late." He said this without drama, in the flat tone of a man who had rehearsed the same facts many hundreds of times and had not yet arrived at an interpretation that absolved him of anything. Penelope looked at the mare. "She did not mean to hurt him," she said at last. "No." A pause. "I know that. But you have not been able to forgive her." "I have not been able to forgive myself," he said, "which is a different problem, and not one the horse can help me solve." Penelope did not answer at once. She let the silence hold in the way. She let Caledonia hold at the gate when the mare was working something through. Then she said, "She does not forgive quickly. Either. She offered me her trust very slowly. I think she knows the value of it." He turned his head then and looked at her directly. In the lamplight, for the first time in 6 months of living in the same house, she felt the warmth climb into her face and kept her gaze on the horse. "How did you know to go to her?" he said. "I could hear her," Penelope said simply. "I could not sleep while she was in distress." He was quiet for a moment. The lantern moved in a small draught from the stable door, and the light shifted on Caledonia's coat, turning it from black to a deep, warm brown in the movement of it. His hands were at his sides, and his face, in that unguarded moment, held something she had not expected, not the grief she knew was there, but something alongside the grief. Something that recognized her standing at the gate in the lamplight and did not know what to do with the recognition. "You go to her every night," he said. It was not a question. "Most nights," she said. "She expects me." He nodded once, as though that explained something he had been working out for several months. And then he looked at the mare again and did not say anything further, and after a reasonable interval, Penelope excused herself and went in, and she carried the warmth of those 5 minutes back to her room as carefully as she would have carried an open flame. If you have felt the quiet astonishment of a thing that arrives before you are ready for it, you will understand what Penelope carried. She did not name it. She had not yet learned that some things will not wait for a name. 3 mornings after this, before the household was properly awake, the Viscount stood at the stable window. He had not planned to. He had risen early because he slept badly when the house was full, which was true of him in general, and had been true since Thomas, and he had gone to the study, intending to review the estate accounts, and had passed the window that looked out to the stable yard and had stopped. The light was the thin, clear light of early July before the sun had reached its full height, and it lay flat on the stable yard stones and the grass beyond the fence. Penelope was in the paddock. She was not exercising the horse. She was standing in the center of the paddock with Caledonia behind her, the mare following at her shoulder, the way a dog follows a beloved person, and Penelope was walking a slow circle with her hands clasped behind her back. And the horse was following, not because she had been told to follow, but because she had decided that where this person went was where she wished to be. He watched this for several minutes. He had, in the past 6 months, watched her carry coal scuttles, and silver trays, and cut flowers from the garden, and letters from the Morning Post, and he had not permitted himself to watch her with any more attention than he permitted himself to give to any aspect of his household's functioning. He was a man who understood the distances propriety required. He had kept those distances with the same discipline he kept everything else, and he had told himself it was ordinary perception, the ordinary attention a man pays to the people who manage his house efficiently and quietly. Caledonia's nose was at Penelope's shoulder. Penelope stopped walking, and the mare stopped with her. Penelope turned and put both hands on the horse's face, one on each side of the long, dark jaw, very gently, and said something close and quiet. Caledonia closed her eyes. He was watching a woman who had walked every night to the source of a grief she had no part in, and had stayed until it was quieter. For no reason he could identify other than that she could not bear to hear something in distress without responding to it. He was watching a creature that had refused every human approach since his brother's death, except with complete trust the hands of a woman who had not asked permission but had earned it instead. He stood at the window a moment longer, until Penelope turned from the mare and walked back toward the house, unhurried with the particular quality of movement he had noticed since autumn, which was not the briskness of someone performing competence, but the ease of someone who knew exactly what she was doing and had no need to demonstrate it to anyone. Then he turned from the window and went to his study, and did not open the estate accounts for some time. He sat at the desk with his hands flat on the surface, and thought about an animal that had refused every human approach in 2 years, and had chosen, with the serene certainty of a creature that cannot be deceived, to follow a woman who had come to her simply because she could not bear to leave her alone in the dark. The house party continued in its planned and elaborate manner for 3 more days. Lady Agatha was pleased with its progress. Miss Casterton played the pianoforte after dinner and sang one song, and she was correct in every particular and pleasing in the general, and the Viscount sat through it with an expression Penelope had learned to recognize as his version of endurance. She was not supposed to have learned his expressions. She had learned them anyway, in the ordinary course of being present in rooms he inhabited, and she kept the knowledge to herself the way she kept everything that belonged to her inner life. Miss Casterton did not go near the stables a second time. She had said at breakfast the morning after the first incident that she preferred animals that had been properly schooled, which was a reasonable position. She had said it in Penelope's hearing. She had glanced at Penelope as she said it, and the glance was the kind that does not quite register the person it lands on, which was also a reasonable position for a woman in Miss Casterton's situation, and Penelope received it as such. On the morning of the exhibition, Lady Agatha moved through the breakfast room, arranging the day with the authority of a general whose campaign was proceeding. The writing display had been her suggestion, and the guest understood the design. Helena in fine habit, Helena on a horse, Helena positioned against the backdrop of Ashbourne Park in a way that suggested she had always been meant to stand there. Lady Agatha said, loudly enough to carry to the sideboard where Penelope was tending the tea service, that it was important for a woman who would manage a house of this consequence to be seen at her ease within it. Then she said to the colonel seated beside her, that a serving girl might not appreciate the distinction, but those who understood what an estate of this quality required would take her meaning. Several of the guests glanced at Penelope. She did not look up from the cream jug. She carried it to the table and withdrew, without hurry. She had not planned to be at the paddock. She had been crossing the yard with a bucket for the hens when the party assembled in its procession of fine habits and morning coats and parasols, and she had stopped because Caledonia was already at the fence with her ears pinned and her nostrils flared wide, and she thought it prudent to stay near in case the mare required settling. She told herself this was the reason, and went to stand at the paddock's near corner and hold the bucket and wait. She was there when Miss Casterton mounted. She was there when Caledonia moved. She was there, with her right hand open and the bucket in her left, when the mare walked at her deliberate coal-black pace to the corner of the paddock and lowered her head to Penelope's palm. And the stable yard was as quiet as a church between the prayers. What she did not see because she was watching the horse was Richard Ashby's face in the full minute that the silence held. She did not see him look from Caledonia to her, and then hold on her face with an expression that was not surprise, because he had known what Caledonia would do the moment the horse turned her head, but was instead something beyond surprise. Something that had been building since October, and had finally arrived at the place where it could no longer be called ordinary perception. She found out that evening that Lady Agatha had also seen it, and had come to a different conclusion. Mrs. Coburn told her at 6:30, before the dinner bell, in the careful voice she used when the news required careful handling. She said that Mr. Fitch had heard from the head footman about an exchange of words in the drawing-room between the Viscount and the Dowager Viscountess, the particulars of which had not come down clearly, but the tone of which had. She said further that Mr. Sachs Fitch had himself said to 3 of the other grooms, in the stable yard where these things carry, that a serving girl who drew a man of the Viscount's station to stand at stable gates in the dark was only going to come to grief, and everyone knew it, and the sooner she understood her place the better for the household. Penelope received this with the composure she had always relied upon. She thanked Mrs. Stingbentan. Coburn, who looked at her with the particular regard she had shown since autumn, the regard of a woman who has watched something grow in a cold place and knows better than to comment on it. Penelope returned to her room. She sat on the edge of the bed for a moment and thought about the gate in the dark and the lamplight and the warmth in his face when he watched Caledonia take the apple. She thought about the stable yard that morning and the complete quiet of 20 people who had suddenly understood that they were watching something that could not be explained by the usual categories. Then she opened her trunk and began to fold her spare dress into it. She was not finished when Lady Agatha knocked, which was a formality, since she came in directly after, as was her right in this house. The dowager stood in the center of the room and looked at the open trunk with an expression that was, Penelope recognized, the expression of a woman who has been proved correct in her assessment of a situation and finds the proof unpleasant rather than satisfying. "You have anticipated my purpose," she said. "I am glad we understand each other." "My lady," Penelope said. "I shall not be uncharitable," Lady Agatha said. "You are clearly capable, and Mrs. Coburn speaks well of your work. There is a position available with the Pendleton household in Chester that would suit your capabilities well, and I am prepared to recommend you to Lady Pendleton personally. You would be comfortable there, and it would remove any occasion for further misunderstanding." She paused. "I am not a cruel woman, Miss Marsh. I am a practical one. You understand, I think, the difficulty." "His lordship," Penelope said, keeping her voice entirely level, "has said nothing to me." "His lordship," Lady Agatha said, with the patience of a woman who has managed men all her life, and found patience the most effective instrument for the purpose, does not always know what he is saying until someone who understands him rather better provides the translation. She closed her fan with a small, precise sound. "I am his mother. I have known him since his first breath, and I know the difference between what he requires and what he imagines he wants, and they are not always the same thing. The horse," she said, her voice cooling by a single deliberate degree, "is an animal. Animals are not a reliable measure of anything that matters. I do not doubt your particular quality with the creature, and I intend you no unkindness. I simply know what an estate of this consequence requires, and it requires more than a serving girl can provide." However competent, she left without waiting for a response. Penelope stood in the room. She would not sleep in again, and understood, with perfect clarity, that Lady Agatha believed every word she had said, and was not wrong in her assessment of the practical matter, and that her own presence at the gate in the dark, and the warmth in her face at the lamplight, and the particular quality of attention she had felt in the paddock that morning were, all of them, things she had had no right to and had accumulated anyway, the way the poor sometimes accumulate small, beautiful things that are not strictly theirs to keep. She went to the stable. Caledonia met her at the gate before she reached it, walking from the far end of the stall with the unhurried certainty of an animal who had expected her. The evening was warm, and the air smelled of cut grass, and the first ripening of the kitchen garden and the stable lantern was already lit, and the light through the gate slats lay in long yellow bars across the stone. Penelope did not go in. She stood at the gate with her hands curled around the top rail and her forehead pressed to the wood, not quite touching the horse's warm neck, and she let herself be still for a moment in the way she was rarely still during working hours. She said very quietly, to no one in particular, "I know what I am." Caledonia pressed her face to the rail beside Penelope's cheek and stood there breathing. She went back to her room and finished folding the dress and closed the trunk, and she lay awake for a long time looking at the ceiling and listening to the September wind beginning in the upper trees, and she thought about usefulness and worth and the distance between them and whether her father had been right that they were the same thing. She thought they might not be. The morning would require her to be practical, and she was above everything a practical woman. In the morning, Penelope carried her trunk down the back stairs at 7, before the guests were stirring. The September air was cool, and the gravel of the stable yard was wet from an early rain, and the first light was low and flat, the particular light that shows every worn place on every surface without apology. Her apron was still tied, because she had not yet determined precisely when she would stop being what she had been and start being whatever came next. She was halfway across the yard when she heard the step. He came from the direction of the house, still in his riding boots, his coat open against the morning cold as though he had been awake since before the light. He stopped when he saw her. He looked at the trunk in her hand, and she watched something move through his expression that she recognized now as the thing he did when he was not managing his face. Several of the departing guests had drifted into the yard for the carriage preparations. Mr. Fitch stood near the stable door. A footman waited at the mounting block. The Dowager Viscountess had appeared at the house's side entrance with the particular alertness of a woman who is managing something she expects to require management. Penelope set the trunk down. She straightened her spine. "Miss Marsh," Richard said, his voice carried in the quiet yard with no effort. "My lord," she said, "I have a reference to a position in Chester, and I intend to take it. You need not concern yourself with the matter." He said, "I do not intend to concern myself with Chester." Wet. He crossed 3 strides of wet gravel and stopped at a distance that every convention of propriety allowed, which was not close, but which was close enough that she was aware of the warmth of him in the cold morning air. He looked at her with the expression she had named, in the dark of the gate conversation, as relief. It was relief of a particular kind. The relief of a man who has decided to stop managing something and is finding the decision unexpectedly bearable. "My lord," Lady Agatha said from the doorway, and something in her voice acknowledged, with the resignation of a practical woman, that the matter had moved beyond translation. Perhaps this conversation might be better conducted inside. Caledonia has had 5 grooms, 2 trainers, and a gentleman who rode her across the continent, he said. He did not raise his voice. He did not look away from Penelope. She threw every one of them. She stood quiet for a woman who came to her in the dark, because she could not bear to hear something in distress without responding to it. He paused for a single breath. "I am asking Penelope Marsh, not the horse, her." The yard was entirely quiet. Mr. Fitch was looking at the gravel with the expression of a man rapidly reconsidering a number of things he had said in the past 48 hours. The footman at the mounting block was looking at nothing at all, very carefully. She had appeared at the side of the departing party with a shawl around her shoulders, and the drawn look of a woman who had slept poorly, and she looked at Penelope for a long, unreadable moment, and then she looked at the Viscount, and then she looked away. The look that passed across her face was not easy to name, but it was not unkind. She was 20 years old, and she had been prepared for this house the way a painting is prepared for a wall, and she was beginning to understand that the wall had a different painting already. Lady Agatha's fan had stopped moving. Penelope felt the warmth move through her face, and did not try to correct it. She looked at him. "You have not asked me anything yet," she said, because it was true, and because she had always preferred truth to alternatives. Something shifted at the corner of his mouth, a thing she had seen precisely once before on a cold evening at a gate, and understood to be rare. "I know," he said. "I am about to." He did not conduct the asking in the stable yard, which would have been irregular, and he was beneath everything. A man of his period and his station, and those forms had not yet left him. But he asked Mrs. Tontu Coburn to make the housekeeper's sitting room available, and he sent his solicitor an express by the afternoon post, and he did not speak to his mother until after he had spoken to Penelope. What he said to her in the sitting room, with the autumn sun slanting through the window and a small fire just lit because the morning had turned cold, was not a declaration in the elaborate sense. He did not do elaborate. He said that he had watched her for 6 months and had told himself it was ordinary attention and had been wrong, and that Caledonia had not been wrong, and that an animal with no reason to pretend had told him plainly and repeatedly what he had been declining to hear. He said that he understood the distance between what he offered and what she had any right to expect, and that he would not pretend the distance was not real. He said that he was 34 years old, and that he had been 40 seconds too late to stop his brother from a decision that cost him everything, and that he was not prepared to be 40 seconds too late again. He said, "I would like you to stay, not as my maid, as my wife, if you will have me." His hands were at his sides, and his voice was level, and he did not look away. Penelope thought about her father, who had told her that a woman's worth was her usefulness, and she thought that he had not been a bad man, only a man whose circumstances had required him to believe that useful things were valuable, and valuable things were useful. And he had taught her this because he loved her after his fashion, and it was the best protection he had known to give her. She thought about Lady Agatha, who had told her that a serving girl was not a reliable index of anything that mattered, and she thought that Lady Agatha was also not a cruel woman, only a woman whose world had required her to believe that station was the principal measure of a person, and who had applied this belief with genuine care for the consequences she understood, and without awareness of the ones she did not. She thought about Caledonia, who had offered her nose to an open hand in the dark, and stood warm and breathing beside a gate rail in the cold, and who had walked across a paddock in front of 20 witnesses to press her face to a specific pair of hands, because trust, once given, does not care about categories. She said, "Yes." She said it in the same quiet tone she used for everything. She watched his face do the thing it did when he stopped managing it. She had a word for it now. It was relief. The betrothal was announced to what remained of the house party at dinner, reduced by then to a smaller party of those whose carriages had been delayed by the afternoon rain, and those who were curious enough to wait. Lady Agatha sat very straight at the table and said the correct things, and did not look at her son more than was required by civility. She was not a cruel woman. She was a practical one. She would in time come to acknowledge that she was also a practical woman, quiet and principled and without appetite for melodrama, and that the accommodation between two such women, once achieved, was nearly impervious to revision. That was not yet. That was for winter and spring after it, and the long, gradual work of learning that sometimes the horse is right. That evening, when the candles had burned low, and the guests had dispersed to their rooms, Penelope went to the stable. She was not a maid any longer, and not yet quite certain what she was instead. The space between one thing and the next was strange, a little vertiginous, the way the first morning after a long illness is strange, when the fever has broken and the body knows it but has not yet learned to move as though health is its permanent condition. She thought she would stand in that space for some time before the ground became solid, and she thought this was probably all right. Caledonia heard her before she reached the gate. The mare came from the far corner of the stall and pressed her face to the top rail in exactly the place she always pressed it, and Penelope put her hand up and laid her palm flat on the long dark nose and felt the warm breath and the particular stillness of an animal entirely at ease. The stable lantern was lit, and its light was warm and small against the dark of the September night, and outside the narrow window the trees were shedding their first leaves, and the season was turning toward the long close of the year. She heard the step behind her and did not startle. "I thought you would be here," he said. "She expects me," Penelope said. He came to stand beside her at the gate, close enough that she was aware of the warmth of him in the cool, stable air, not touching, which was, as was correct. And Caledonia turned her head to regard him with the mild, interested attention she gave to people she had decided to permit. He put his hand out, beside Penelope's on the rail, and after a long considering moment, during which the mare looked at his hand and at Penelope's face and appeared to conduct some internal calculation, Caledonia pressed her nose to his open fingers. He held very still, the way Penelope had learned to hold still when something she valued was trusting her with something. The lantern held its light. Outside, the wind was up in the upper branches, and there was the particular quality in the air that said rain was coming before morning, and there was a great deal of the world ahead of them, full of things that would require managing and adjusting and coming to terms with, and none of it was simple or without cost. Caledonia stood with her nose in his hand, and her ears soft, and her breathing easy. And Penelope stood beside him at the gate, and the lantern held its light, and the mare was not snarling at anything at all. Thank you for staying with Penelope and Caledonia until the end. If their story moved you, leave a thought below. There is a small painting in the upper corridor of Ashburn Park, done in the spring of the following year, that a visitor might walk past without pausing. It shows a black mare in a field, ears forward, nose down to a woman's open hand. The woman's back is to the viewer. Beside her, a tall man in a dark coat stands at the fence rail in the particular way of a man who has learned that the most valuable things sometimes arrive without announcement, and that the correct response, when they do, is to hold very still. They hung it there themselves. Caledonia in the painting is not snarling at anything at all.